Okay, since we got a minute or two before class starts, let me just let you sort of update you on the project. You should have gotten the thing I sent out that has, what everyone's going to work on specifically. I got some feedback from a few folks and no feedback from a fair number of folks. So congratulations on, getting picked for whatever you got picked for. We're probably not going to be going out to the stream. I'd really hoped we could in a couple of weeks. It isn't a COVID thing. It's a bureaucracy thing. I just found out a couple of days ago that for some reason, and I have no idea why, Department of Health at the state level has something to do whether you access streams. Now I know I've worked with the forestry guys off and on for 40 years, and we just go out there. But I suspect that because they're part of the state, they get like a waiver, just like all the other DLNR guys do. And I know Board of Water Supply they must get a waiver too. So all I can think of in the past, I've always worked with agencies. So I assume if you're on contract to the agency, you just fall under their window. We don't, because we're at the University of Chaminade. I know the guys at Tropical Ag over at UH go out the stream all the time, but I have a really bad feeling they just basically are sort of grandfathered in, and they just don't, just do whatever they're going to do, and DOH doesn't go after them. I can't assume the same thing since we're new at this. And right now, given how much on their plate DOH has, I really don't think they're going to be particularly interested in dealing with us. So I figure by the time I figure out who I'm supposed to contact there, how I'm going to write them, how they're going to respond back, and what we're going to have to go through, assuming the university is even willing to put the risk up, since Chaminade's very risk adverse. It just doesn't seem like it's going to happen this semester. So figure on not going out, simply ironically not because of the virus, but simply because of the various levels of state bureaucracy. If you've worked here for any length of time, which you guys probably haven't, but one thing you will very quickly find out is that when you're doing something here, it's not unusual to have 6 or 8 different agencies involved. If you're involved, for example, in fish pond repair work, or even any sort of fish pond mitigation, or even reef mitigation, you can have up to 3 federal agencies, 6 or 7 state agencies, and a couple of city and county agencies, all involved in what they're just saying, should you even be out there? Can you even walk on the reef? And all sorts of stuff that at some point gets pretty ludicrous because they're not actually protecting the public interest. It's just on their plate. So, this wasn't totally unexpected, though I have to admit it never occurred to me Department of Health would have anything to do with stream flow or stream access, but apparently they do. And apparently DLNR sort of lets them take the lead on a lot of this, which for the life of me, I don't understand. So bummers, but as they say, all this process is basically a learning process. So that's a new one on me. Let's see, I guess first, are there any questions about what I sent out on the project? Okay. Go ahead. Okay. Just as a note, I think I sent them out as announcements, so do read them. One of the things that came up a couple of times, people are starting to get a little worried, what do I expect in terms of a document out of you guys? I don't want a term paper or research paper. What I want is basically your notes. If you want to think of in this context, visualize us working in some sort of a, I don't know, nonprofit or corporate setting, and we've been contracted to do this work. So each of you are part of that team that are basically contributing to what would eventually be an overall document, which is what we're going to have. So I don't expect it to be written up in a beautiful way. I do want all your sources. I do want everything you've got. And I also want what your thoughts were in the sense of what you think is going on. If you think you see patterns, if you're surprised at something that showed up and you didn't expect it. All those insights are equally useful because, as I pointed out a bunch of times, no one's ever done this before in Hawaii, and very rarely, in fact, I can only think of 1 or 2 cases where they've done it anywhere in the United States. It's not an American thing. So community studies in this type of detail with this type of a range to them, we don't really have a lot of, I couldn't give you some good examples, for example, of other ones done in the US. So we're pretty much doing these, I know how these work as they're done in Europe. So we're basically, figuring this out as we move along. And again, here in Hawaii, of course, never been really anything like this. So we're basically starting up, cold on this. So what you think you see or what you had thought to see and you didn't, is sort of your intuitive assessment of what you're looking at is just as valid as stuff. Be sure you keep them separate. But do record everything you find, and also record what you looked at. As I mentioned a bunch of times, do record where you looked and you didn't find stuff. So for example, if you're doing the newspaper, say the social history, and in the period all of a sudden you realize there's a totally just 3 years gap where absolutely nothing comes up, and then all of a sudden there's stuff that shows up, and then on the other side of that gap stuff shows up again. That's relevant because it makes you wonder what was going on that you've got that gap. Was it a gap because nothing happened? Was it a gap because of censorship or people that were uncomfortable talking about it? At this point, we won't know because we're going to be collecting this stuff for at least a couple of semesters at minimum. Okay. So there's no questions on that. I guess not. Okay, let's segue into the material. Double check something here. Okay. Last time I finished up on the Portuguese and pretty much got done with them. So the Portuguese, remember, I'm sort of hopping around time-wise, so go back and look at that timeline I sent you guys out. Portuguese are arriving here 1878 to 1882, 1883 for only a 5-year window, almost exactly the same time as the Chinese. They sort of parallel with. So they're here very early. Those are the first 2 groups of plantation-based immigrants in Hawaii. The Filipinos aren't going to arrive for another 30 years. The Japanese will arrive in another couple of years. So these guys are already in place. They're already, in many cases, off the plantation and to a certain extent settled when your next big group, which would be the Japanese, arrive. Now, before we get to the Japanese, I want to cover one other group, which hops us ahead 20 years. So this next group is actually after the Japanese. So if we want to put into context, Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, then you have Okinawans, Koreans, and right at the end of the Koreans in this period, right around the turn of the century, at the same time will become part of the United States. In fact, that's really significant here. This group shows up, and that's the Puerto Ricans. And about 10, 15 years after they show up, then the Filipinos show up. So this is one of your later groups. In fact, in some ways you could say it's the next to last big group. And let's do a visual here. To understand why we end up with Puerto Ricans here, you have to go into 2 main things. One is the constant plantation system. The plantation owners, as we've gone through a bunch of times, are very, very good at basically nickel and diming their staff, i.e. their workforce, right out of the job, in the sense that they provide so little in the way of money and pay and conditions that as quick as people can, they get the hell off the plantation. So the plantation is constantly searching for a new workforce. And if you remember in the 1870s, 1880s, they bring the Portuguese in as sort of this lower middle level management group to basically oversee the Asian population, which is the cutting cane field force. And again, their Manini attitude towards the Portuguese means that very quickly the Portuguese ditch. Now, if you remember, there was a second group of Portuguese. There's the Portuguese coming over from Portugal proper in the late 19th century. That group is urban. That group comes over here. It takes one look at the conditions here in Hawaii and goes, we ain't doing this. They're not field workers. You have to remember in a lot of Europe, and maybe due to the idea of the peasant in European history, working in the fields is very low status. There's nothing lower in European societies, even today, than someone who's actually out in a field plowing stuff. You can do that in sort of a gentlemanly fashion if you own a farm, but you don't really want to be caught working on the farm. So your field workforce are actually working in fields was an incredibly low status and prestige in European society. So when the second group of Portuguese comes over, who are from mainland Portugal, so they're totally classic Portuguese, European, unlike their earlier Azoran and Madeiran counterparts. They take one look at what they've been hired to do, which is, work out in the fields supervising the Asian populations. And they go, that ain't happening. And they just disappear and largely move on to the US mainland. So this was an absolute fiasco. And when the plantations recruited this group, they thought, we'll get another 10 or 15 years out of this group before they leave, and then we're going to have to find another level of sort of, cheap middle management. But instead, this group was gone within a couple of years, and in many cases, they couldn't do the work anyways. They knew nothing about sugar, they knew nothing about agriculture or farming. They were urbanites, and then they just didn't understand what the hell was going on. So they were a total lost cause for the plantations. So in desperation, they're now struggling, trying to figure out who we're going to get for these guys in the middle. Now, in this context, two other big things have occurred. One is in 1893, the monarchy's pulled out, and it's replaced by the republic. And this is with the connivance of the U.S. Basically ambassador, called the Consul General at the time, the ambassador here in Hawaii, on his own cognizance. In other words, the U.S. government back in Washington doesn't know, but the U.S. Ambassador here, the Consul General, convinces the Commodore of the small U.S. naval squadron that's based in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor, to support a small group of anti-monarchy insurrectionists, basically about 60 folks, almost all of who are actually tied to the missionary boys. Now, in many cases, are not actually part of that group per se. To a person, they have never taken Hawaiian citizenship. They have always kept their American citizenship, which was sort of a vague way of protesting the monarchy or something. They're terribly concerned about Liliuokalani trying to push Hawaiians into a dominant position in the voting registry again, which they were deathly afraid of. The Basic Constitution had basically disenfranchised large numbers of Hawaiians. She was also, like her brother, very interested in bringing in the recent plantation immigrants, the Chinese, the Portuguese, and the Japanese in as monarchy citizens, which immediately, of course, to this highly elite group would have just basically meant they were shafted, because all of a sudden they would have been outnumbered about 20 to 1, 30 to 1 in terms of voting. So they basically saw themselves in a crisis situation. Seiler's book about this period is probably the best. It's really hard to sort of fathom. I mean, Liliuokalani knew what she was doing. Why she didn't take these guys as a threat seriously, I don't really know. And I don't know you're ever going to know unless we can go back in time and actually talk to her. But for some reason, she didn't think they were going to do anything. And unfortunately, she judged that totally wrong. They get the support of the Consul General and the U.S. military, i.e. the Navy and Marines, to basically support their operation. So you end up with this sort of, goofy, Douglas Adams type scenario of about 40 or 50 guys with guns, surrounded by basically 150 U.S. Marines and Navy personnel with 2 ships offshore with guns aimed at Iolani Palace, who march on the palace and basically, take over the Hawaiian government. Liliuokalani is, as you probably well know, doesn't do anything about it. She basically thinks that the U.S. government, when they find out what the council's done, because remember, this wasn't done by Washington. The President of the United States didn't authorize this, nor did Congress. This was done by the ambassador on the location. So her view is when the U.S. government realizes what happens, that they're going to tell everyone to back off, and they're going to tell these guys, go move somewhere else, and they're going to apologize to the Queen and restore the monarchy. The U.S. had just signed another mutual defense treaty a couple of years earlier with Hawaii, so she had every logic to believe that basically the U.S. would honor its obligations. Unfortunately for her, that doesn't happen. Ironically, the U.S. Congress thinks that they probably should give Hawaii back to the monarchy, but Congress about then was just about as dysfunctional as Congress is now. So the bill gets stuck in Congress, and a bunch of infighting means it never gets processed. So the new president of the United States says Hawaii should go back to the monarchy, but you can't get Congress to sign it into law, which means that there's nothing forcing things to happen. So the insurrectionists basically end up with a new government. Because the U.S. government is at best ambivalent, and actually in many cases doesn't want Hawaii to be part of the United States, what happens is the U.S. won't take Hawaii as a territory, which was the original intent. That's what the Consul General wanted. He thought the guys would, fly the American flag, and 2 days later, when Washington found, they'd say, okay, and the United States would have a new territory. But it didn't work that way. So for the next 6 years, the Hawaii-U.S. relationship stumbles along with a republic that was never intended to exist, as these insurrectionists tried to figure out how to basically sketch up a system, and make it happen. They actually, in their own sort of goofy way, did a pretty decent job, in large part just because they copied the Hawaiian monarchy. They just sort of changed the label at the top of the pages. 1897, 1898, the other thing happens. The United States, largely the U.S. media, the same media that did the Yellow Peril, if you remember our earlier discussion, was pumping that the United States had this what we call manifest destiny. Feel free to look that up. I think we might have covered it a little bit a while ago. There was this mindset that was very typical of what was going on in Europe, especially England and Germany at the time, that basically God had given, you can fill in your group, the power and the okay to take over the rest of the world and basically make them into surrogates of you because you're the best that there was out there. So this is the reason for the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and the Western Pacific. All are based on this idea that a European group is by its inherent nature superior to anyone else on the planet. And therefore, it's their obligation almost to take over other folks and civilize them. Now, the United States had done a pretty spectacular job of this, moving across the continental United States, and that's why Indians ended up on reservations. But by the 1860s, 1870s, of course, they'd run into the Pacific Ocean, and you couldn't go north or south because those are independent countries, and the United States sort of fills up. So this manifest destiny thing was originally what you might think was like the California gold rush, the westward migration, all that type of stuff. Now the rhetoric persists. The problem is by the 1890s, the United States doesn't have any place to manifest its destiny within the continental United States. They've taken over Alaska, but that was actually that was a cash transaction. And so there's this sort of pent-up demand that there's other places in the world that need to be civilized. And since the Americans are, quote, the best people out there, it's the obligation of the United States to civilize less fortunate people, again, fill in the blank. In this rhetoric, which is constantly being pumped by the media, what happens is we pick a new enemy. The United States decides that the Spanish are really, really bad people. And so what you get is not so much the Spanish in Spain, but Spanish colonies, especially in the Atlantic, are suddenly seen as these dens of iniquity and horror and nightmares and all sorts of rude, nasty things. And the Spanish shoot people on sight and bump it up and up and up. It just goes on and on. Again, as with the Yellow Peril, there was no truth in a lot of stuff. It was just the media, especially about newspapers, just making up stories to sell papers. And so it wasn't unusual. If you look at newspapers, the headlines one day will be, Chinese enslaving white women. And then 2 days later, it'll be Spanish shooting protesters in Havana or something like that. And both stories will be entirely made up, but they sold papers and people were really stoked on this. What you get by 1897 is basically a sense in the American ethos that the United States has to do something about these excesses and horrors, these near genocidal behavior of the Spanish. So the United States has to sort of sort this shit out. That becomes sort of the rhetoric in the American public. And then what happens is actual, protests for independence from Cuba largely drive this. You have to remember by this period of time, most of Latin America, the continental part of it, had long since been independent. Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and places like that have been independent since the 1830s. Mexico's been independent since, I think, 1827 or something like that. So these places were independent, but the island areas in the Caribbean hadn't followed suit. They had in many cases remained colonies. In fact, a lot of them are still colonies today. The British, the Dutch, the French all have large colonies in the Caribbean. And so the Americans decide for some reason they got to have something to do with this. And so what happens is there's a protest, sort of like something like the Hong Kong protest. So there's a big protest in Havana, which is the large city in Cuba. And the Spanish crack down on it, and some people get shot. It's really nasty, and of course it gets entirely hyped up in the American press. So the American government sends out this ship. I don't know what you want to call it. It was technically an armored cruiser, but it's this sort of odd-looking thing called the USS Maine. She parks in Havana Harbor to basically protect American interest. I have no idea what that particularly means. And so in that situation, they're sort of hanging around, drinking coffee and doing whatever. And all of a sudden, one morning, I think it is, all of a sudden, wham, the ship blows up. And immediately in the American press, it's that the Spanish have blown up the ship. They've sabotaged it for the purpose of, getting the United States out of Cuba. Well, the whole thing was sort of weird from the get-go because one, the United States wasn't in Cuba. Two, the Maine was actually, they just finished having a party with the Spanish the night before. So, the whole thing was very strange. In fact, studies from the 1960s on have pointed out that what it was badly stored ammunition. The ship blew herself up. But this became the battle cry. So all of a sudden it was now, remember the Maine. And so the United States jumps in and starts going after every Spanish colony they can get their hands on to attack the Spanish and get them out and basically replace them with the better Americans. At least that's how the Americans see it. They take over Cuba, they take over Puerto Rico, they take over some of the other island possessions in the Caribbean. And of course, the other big one they go after is they go after the Philippines, the Spanish possession in the Pacific. Spanish are totally unprepared for this. Spain is just almost as bankrupt as Portugal. So it's an absolute fiasco. The Americans, for whatever set of reasons, and again, you'd have to maybe mention someone would know. I've never really studied this. I mean, McNally would probably know. Is the Americans spun it to the folks in the areas they were moving into that they were going to give them independence. So they told the Puerto Ricans and the Cubanos and the Filipinos that what they were going to do is liberate them from the Spanish. And not surprisingly, if you live on Cuba and someone says you're going to get liberated, you think, oh, that means we're going to be free and independent country. What the United States did is then slapped the American flag down and said, congratulations, you're now territories of the United States. And all three of these areas, people went, now, wait a heck, what the hell? We didn't switch the Spanish for you guys. We thought you were supposed to free us from the Spanish, as in no one in charge but us. And so there were immediate, pretty massive insurrections against American control in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The Filipino War was by far the most brutal. Thousands of people died. It was an absolutely brutal conflict. The Americans lost tons of troops in the Philippines. It was actually worse than Vietnam on per capita basis. And it lasted for about 3 years, and then finally it sort of died down. But there was a real bad taste in the mouth of the Filipinos towards American rule ever after. In the case of Cuba, what happened is the American press suddenly did a flip and decided that, oh, maybe we shouldn't take the place over. Now they started stereotyping the Cubans as basically being like the Spanish. And so all of a sudden the United States backed away and decided, okay, we're going to let the Cubans be independent. Puerto Rico, no such luck. For some reason, the United States decided to keep Puerto Rico. And for one thing, the insurrection wasn't that big. And Puerto Rico was poor enough. I think a lot of folks just, needed something. So Puerto Rico stays with the United States as an unincorporated territory. Now, Guam also gets acquired at the same time. So this is, where a lot of the stuff in the Pacific, where some of your relatives are probably from, were acquired in 1898, 1899 during the Spanish-American War. So the Americans come in and decide they're going to show them the way of life, which of course is the American way of life. Now in that context, it's now 1899, so it's a year in, and so Puerto Rico is now part of the United States. And the plantation owners here are looking for that middle level management group. And again, because for some reason their knowledge of people was very poor, they decided that Puerto Ricans were basically like the Portuguese. Don't ask me why. So they assumed that if they recruited from Puerto Rico, one, they'd have people that were familiar with sugar, which is true. That's the main crop even today in Puerto Rico is sugar. And two, they decided that since they were Spanish, or at least how they thought that they were, that they would basically be, European haole, like that second group of Portuguese. So they thought they were basically recruiting a Spanish-speaking, Spanish system group of plantation workers that could replace the Portuguese who ditched on them. Sort of low-level management. And I think they had the attitude that, well, this the great advantage of the Puerto Ricans would be since they spoke Spanish, they'd be easier to communicate with. You wouldn't have to learn Portuguese, which is pretty difficult. So they thought, oh, this is going to work out really well. So they recruit large numbers of Puerto Ricans to work in Hawaii. Now, the Puerto Ricans, like the Portuguese back in the Azores, Madeira over here, weren't adverse to it simply because economic conditions in Puerto Rico were trashed. They'd been really bad under the Spanish. All the Spanish money and interest was focused on Cuba, not on Puerto Rico. So there was basically no money coming in. The sugar industry had taken a big hit recently. So a lot of folks were out of work. And then, of course, the Americans take over, have no idea what they're doing. And so what was left of the economic system just sort of collapsed. And so when these guys come up and say, hey, you want to go work for a sugar plantation in Hawaii, they had no idea where the hell they were going, just like everyone else. They went, yeah, okay, what the hell? It's better than just sitting here and watching the grass grow. And so what happens is they come in thousands to Hawaii. Now, Puerto Ricans are an interesting group for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is by now it's the turn of the 20th century, so it's 1900, and I guess you could say the plantations are a little more sophisticated. I'm really hesitant to use that term. One would have thought they would have a shorter learning curve, but they really had a hard time sort of picturing stuff, I guess. So on one hand, I think they were a little more cynical about the Puerto Ricans in the sense that they thought they might ditch ship just like the Portuguese had a couple of years earlier. But they thought again, well, if we bring them over as families and and maybe this will work out. The Puerto Ricans actually stayed on the plantation longer than almost any other group. A lot of Puerto Ricans were working on the plantations as late as the 1920s, early 1930s. A lot of the plantations didn't get involved in the Puerto Rican movement. They'd figured out other ways to do middle management, and they just decided, now we're going to not, I think they thought it was not going to work. So they just didn't jump on board. So unlike the earlier groups, unlike the Portuguese and of course the Chinese and the Japanese and the Filipinos, what you find is with the Puerto Ricans, they're place specific. So for example, the plantations on Kauai, on the north shore of the Kilauea, Honolulu region, they didn't recruit Puerto Ricans. The Kaloa Mills and Grove Farm in the south part of Kauai recruited a lot of Puerto Ricans. Here on Oahu, I don't know that any of the plantations recruited large numbers. I seem to remember that the Pearl City Mill did, but I'm not really too sure. On Maui, 3 of the mills did, but the other ones didn't. On the Big Island, it's sort of the same thing. A lot of the Kohala mills recruited Puerto Ricans, but other groups didn't. Other mills didn't. So what happened is the Puerto Ricans didn't end up spread across the islands. They ended up in clusters in particular places. And as a result of that, what happened is because they stayed on the plantations, a lot of them stayed fairly localized around the plantation. Even when they left the plantation, they tended to stay with the Puerto Rican community. And so what you'll find is you can go through, parts of Hawaii and you'll see no Puerto Ricans. And you go through all of a sudden some other spot and bang, they're all over the place, and then they disappear again. And what you're actually seeing is sort of a vestige of the old plantation system. So the Puerto Ricans are not spread evenly across the Hawaiian Islands. If you go to the south part of Kauai, they're all over the place. In fact, at least into the 1990s, they still had Thursday night kachi dancing going on. Like 3rd generation, 4th generation Puerto Ricans. So what you have is a very different community compared to our earlier ones. They're a highly visible group here. They intermarried as like the Portuguese and the other groups, but they were very clear on their self-identity. And one of the interesting things about the group is, of course, Puerto Ricans are like the rest of the Spanish Empire, a very complex mix of Spanish immigrants coming to the Caribbean, combined with escaped African slaves, and enslaved escaped Indians, and all sorts of other groups. So Puerto Ricans as a population are a typical Caribbean population. They're very, very mixed in terms of appearance and in terms of actual heritage. Very few of them can actually claim descent from Spain per se, because the Spanish tended to fix more on the continental areas like Mexico and Colombia and stuff. So Puerto Ricans are part of the Caribbean sugar plantation system like Jamaica and all the rest of that area. So the population was very, very mixed. In that regard, they're actually pretty similar to the Portuguese from the Madeiras and Azores. Very cosmopolitan population that came out here, which is probably the only reason why some of the plantations were really ambivalent about bringing them in. They just didn't really see them as fitting their stereotype of, sort of the haole view, especially by the early part of the 20th century when race was becoming a much bigger issue. So again, it was very, very plantation specific. And there's still in many cases clustered communities of Puerto Ricans even into the 2020s that are still in some cases pretty closely located to where they originally, the families were originally recruited back in the early 20th century. Because we were a territory by 1900, this meant that things like contract law had to be followed more realistically. So the plantations weren't able to basically pull the Portuguese stunt on the Puerto Ricans. They couldn't just give them a saw and point or sell them a saw and point them out to the trees and say, okay, this cliffside is your land and, here's your house. They gave them the same deal, by the way, was the house and land thing that they'd given the Portuguese. But because we're part of the United States by this time, they actually have to fulfill the contract. So in the case of the Puerto Ricans, they actually had to build them, because oftentimes they're really tiny, but they actually had to build them a house. And they actually had to give them land that was sort of not completely half-assed, and sort of decent. So the Puerto Ricans sort of got a better deal out of the plantations. It wasn't because the plantations were feeling good about it, just because they couldn't pull the same games they could under the monarchy. So this is probably one reason why the Puerto Ricans tend to stay on the plantations more than the earlier groups. Now, like the Portuguese, however, they were sort of a puzzle, because on one hand, they were Spanish speaking, so they spoke a European language. On their heritage, at least in part, was typical of the Spanish Empire. So it was oftentimes what it was called Hispanic, which is you still see with, for example, Filipino populations around Manila and stuff, Tagalogs, for example, where you get this sort of Spanish heritage complex. That's true of many places the Spanish controlled for long periods of time. So in that regard, the two Americans, and even here in Hawaii, they looked like Mexicans and other groups from Latin America. And so that meant that they were seen as being more Haole in contrast to the Asian majority population, which you had by 1900 here. And so people weren't really too sure what box to put them in. And so like the Portuguese, they ended up sort of between or betwixt in a sort of a liminal state between the Haole on one hand and sort of the working plantation population on the other. And of course, this was amplified by the fact that they weren't actually cutting cane, they were managing the folks cutting cane. So they were in supervisory roles as lonas. So what happens is with the other populations, the plantation still reams them pretty severely. So they very quickly, if they stay in the plantation, they don't like it. And so they see themselves as much closer aligned to the folks that they're managing rather than the guys that are on top. So they very quickly start to intermarry with your other populations. I've never seen any particular pattern or study done in terms of who the Puerto Ricans tend to intermarry with. The Portuguese tended to really intermarry with Hawaiians and Chinese a lot, but that's probably just historical reality. Though even second and third generation Portuguese, at least on Maui, I'm starting to realize, it's real typical for Portuguese even today on Maui to marry in with part Chinese families and part Hawaiian families. So I don't know. I've never seen a study on there. I don't think anyone's ever looked at it. Who the Puerto Ricans tend to see as partners. But as with a lot of the other groups, in fact, the majority groups, they tend to outmarry. Having said that, Puerto Ricans are very big on their sort of cultural package or their value system. And that tends to be sort of heavily tutored into the next generation. So folks that are part Puerto Rican tend to have a fairly good cognizance of a fair number of Puerto Rican values and attitudes and festivals and stuff like that and celebrate them. There's a very visible part of the community here in Hawaii. They're not a huge part in terms of numbers, but because they tended to be pretty place specific and they tended to pretty much stay in their particular zone, and because they remained in the plantation system longer, on one hand they assimilated, but in a different way. And this is actually not that unusual compared to the other groups also. Each group sort of has its own history, but the reason they get here is the same. What happens when they get here is oftentimes the same. But what they do as a result of that tends to vary tremendously from one group to the next. If you think of the Portuguese and the Chinese, they arrive at the same time, and have been very different, parts of the sort of ethos that makes up Hawaii. So Puerto Ricans are an interesting group. Like the Portuguese, they sort of make this whole concept of Haole very complex. And it's one of the reasons that I mentioned before that Haole here right into the mid 20th century really wasn't a color thing, because the Portuguese and the Puerto Ricans in many cases weren't white and sort of the classic mainland American stereotype of white Americans. And yet they definitely were not part of the Asian majority population. So there was sort of this in-between group, and then that's really important for the very complex pattern that becomes local. Puerto Ricans are a big contributor to the idea of the diversity that makes up the local population. Okay, so with that, let me switch over to this. Sorry, I'm playing with Google Earth here, so hang on a sec. Run, babes, stop. Oh, shoot, that was done. No, okay, let's do this way. Oops. The next big group, in fact, this in many ways is sort of like a snake swallowing an egg or a stone. That's the Japanese arriving here. Again, it's a very, very short period of time. It's basically 6 years. And if you remember, I mentioned, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago about the fact if you were walking down a street, say in downtown Honolulu in 1875, 1876, you would have seen a few Chinese and a couple of Portuguese, but everyone would have been Hawaiian, part Hawaiian, the classic Haole mix that you would have had here. But largely Hawaiian would have been your majority population by far. 2 years later, walking down that same street, say walking down 4th Street, You would have seen the majority population now is Chinese. So the 1 out of 4 or 5 people that you bumped into would be Chinese, having just arrived. There'd be a large number of Portuguese, obviously just fresh off the boat also. And so what happens is the number of Hawaiians and sort of the, the classic haole, i.e. the first arrival groups, actually isn't shrinking in terms of their total numbers, but it's because these other numbers are growing so rapidly, they become an ever smaller minority. So the Hawaiians start to become a minority in Hawaii because of the huge populations being brought in to work the plantations. It's not so much that they're disappearing, it's just that they're disappearing because this massive group came in and suddenly filled up the house, as it were. And so, if you walk down that same street, all of a sudden a bunch of folks are now Chinese and Portuguese. If you walk down that same street just 4 years later, 1 out of 4, in the case of Honolulu, 1 out of 3 people you bumped into would be Japanese and fresh off the boat. Now the Chinese would still be there and the Portuguese would still be there, but the Japanese are now this huge part of the population that completely dominates all the other groups in terms of total numbers. And basically they are the dominant force into the early part of the 20th century in terms of actual physical numbers of people in Hawaiian Islands. The Filipinos come in a more steady stream. They don't come in a huge lump especially the 1915 to 1930 period. So you end up with large numbers of Filipinos here, but they're not coming in an incredibly short window of like 3 to 5 years. So Japanese are by far the single largest group to come over in an incredibly short period of time. And they have a huge impact here. Now, there's some similarities to the Chinese migration. There's also some differences. And so let me go over those first. So now we go back to history again. Okay, here you see what are called the Japanese home islands, with Kyushu on the south and Hokkaido in the north. And the main island is Honshu. And what you have is from the period from about 1600 into the 1860s, so what, 250 years basically. The guys running Japan are called the shogunate. You don't have to remember this stuff. It's the Tokugawa clan. So what you have is a clan that's running Japan. There's a Japanese emperor, but he's basically a bird trapped in a gilded cage. So you have a military elite that runs Japan as part of a family operation, and they control the islands. Because they're constantly paranoid about being whacked by their enemies, which is all the other families, they come up with this rather interesting strategy in the 1600s that they basically take away guns from all their enemies. So for example, the Tokugawa soldiers had guns. In fact, that's how they'd conquered Japan from their enemies. But they made sure no one else did. And by the 1650s, because of the Spanish and the Portuguese sniffing around the edges and trying to cause trouble, what they do is they basically decide to shut Japan down. So what they do is they basically make Japan isolated, to the extent that, for example, if anyone who's European, if their ship runs aground here in Kyushu, the local lord, the Japanese lord, has orders to basically execute them on the spot, burn their ship, and take their cargo. So what you do is you basically erase the outside world, and you make Japan into a little pocket with no outside contact except in Nagasaki. And so they managed to keep that up for about 200 years, right into the 1850s, 1860s. By the early 19th century, by the 1800s, this is becoming intolerable to the Europeans, especially the British, the French, and the Americans, because by now they're doing enormous amounts of trade with China. We've also got the whaling fleet starting to show up. And so there's a bunch of people running around this part of the Pacific, and given, cyclones and all the rest of that, there's people constantly running around Japan because, among other things, you're not allowed to map the place. So, basically they have like this, I suppose dragons painted on there and a question mark on their maps. I have no idea what the hell it is. So they're just, they're starting to lose ships and guys all over the place. They're thinking, dudes, we're in the 19th century. We're supposed to be civilized. What the hell is this nonsense? So the Americans finally decide they've had enough. They send in a military squadron into the harbor at Yokohama, which was then the town around Edo, which is now called Tokyo. And what they do is they basically tell the Japanese government, i.e. this shogunate, that you guys got to quit this nonsense. We don't care whether you want to open the borders, but you're going to open them yourself, or else we're going to, with military force, open them for you. The Japanese government backs off. They shut the borders down, and now Japan's opened up to outside contact. But this is occurring in the mid-19th century. In fact, it's the last area in the world, it's Korea a little bit. It's basically the last area in the world that gets opened up to European American contact. But what makes it very different is the Japanese keep control of Japan. So rather than China, we end up with a bunch of colonial possessions, or Southeast Asia, where it all ends up colonized, or the Pacific, where it's all colonized with the exception of Hawaii till later. What you end up in Japan is they keep their independence. What you end up with is a really brutal series of really nasty civil wars. I think there's this really bad Tom Cruise movie done a while ago called Last Samurai or something like that, which is based on a historical incident in part from this last series of civil wars. When the dust finally settles, two things have happened. One is the emperor now is put in a position of authority, which he hasn't had for ages. And they now move the emperor from Kyoto, which is where the emperor's always basically hung out, and they move him into the new capital, which they renamed Tokyo. So Tokyo is actually a new name. That city was called Edo until the late 19th century. In that context, what happens is they decide that they're going to have to join the modern world. And this is where it's sort of creepy in some ways, because Japan basically decides it's going to move from a society that's sort of like one of those bad samurai movies. It's a group of guys walking around with swords in their belts, sort of whacking the crap out of anything they feel like. They decide they're going to move from that to basically Victorian England in the space of 10 years, which is sort of, I think everyone thought they were nuts at the time, but the buggers did it. And Japan basically became, by the late 19th century, becomes one of the world's great colonial powers in less than 20 years. It's an absolutely mind-blowing performance, which has never been replicated, and probably it's just as well it wasn't. In this situation, the Japanese have a bunch of issues. One is they don't have anything that anyone wants to buy from them. So if they want to buy guns, if they want to buy the stuff and become modernized and westernized, even buy stuff for a factory, they have to come up with a way to get cash. And they also have the problem that the groups in the southern part of the islands down here had fought against the imperial takeover of Japan. So basically, at the end of the Civil War, this whole section down here had fought against the guys that won the Civil War. So they're sort of the version of the Confederacy, I guess you want to use the American analogy. And so there's a whole mess of huge bad blood about this whole thing. And so what the Japanese government cleverly decides to do, which is really a smart move on their part, is this whole part, by the time the wars ended in 1878, this whole southern part of Japan has been totally trashed. All the villages have been burned, tons of folks have been killed, and anyone who still lives down here is looked by suspicion by the Japanese government as, potential revolutionary, basically, or a terrorist. Actually, it's probably the Japanese government would have called them. And so what they decide to do is, rather than just kill them all, which would be a waste of time, is they basically tell the folks down in here, especially around the area around here, which was one of the center of the anti-imperial movement. Was under the group of I can't remember the name of the daimyo. So it's around Hiroshima, Hiroshima Prefecture, which runs around in here. So this was a group the government doesn't trust. And so what they tell these folks is, right now we would just as soon you guys disappeared. And every year or so they'd run a sweep through here, and young men, for example, would either be taken as slaves into the military, or they would just kill them on the spot or whatever they felt like doing. So in this situation, basically, this part of Japan's in anarchy. So it's very much like the Chinese were facing a couple of years earlier. And along comes the guys in the plantation. China's been shut down to them because they screwed the Chinese over so badly. So they're looking for a new source of warm bodies to cut cane. And they go to this newly opened country, Japan. They go to the Japanese government and basically say, hey, we need a bunch of people to work as plantation laborers here in Hawaii and cut cane and stuff like that. Can we do any recruiting? And the government initially says no, because they need their Japanese citizens for what they're into. And suddenly someone goes, hey, wait a second. What about these buggers down here? We don't trust these guys. We don't really want them around anyways. So why don't we tell the plantations, yeah, but you can only recruit from here. And everyone in Japan apparently had a case of the giggles and thought it was a really great idea. And so what happens is they basically tell them, yeah, okay, you can recruit from Hiroshima Prefecture, but not the rest of Japan. So the plantations go down here and they do the recruiting. And not surprisingly, given the absolutely shitty conditions these guys found themselves in, that just like the Chinese counterparts, the Japanese families tell their younger sons, guess what, you're going to get your ass on a boat to Hawaii, because that's the only way that you're going to save the family, because we have no food, the government's after us. They're going to, they would just assume we died. So it's your job to basically send us money so we can buy food, the family will survive for another year. So they come over in exactly the same way that the Chinese did earlier. They come over here as the life preserver for a group of people, i.e. the family, in a war-torn refugee sort of anarchic situation. And so that's the Japanese. The Japanese that arrive here are not from the central part of Japan. They're from the main island, but from the southern part of Honshu. It's not hugely different. Unlike China, this doesn't mean a separate ethnic group. Chinese are very culturally cohesive, but it does mean that they're not players in the way that the system works. The central part of Japan is basically Kyoto, Osaka, Tokyo. So these guys were definitely not players. This is the group that comes to Hawaii. So the Japanese that come to Hawaii, like their Chinese counterparts, are actually from a very small part of Japan. Many of the folks that come to Hawaii are actually from the same village or same cluster of villages in the same part of Hiroshima Prefecture. So if you're part Japanese, it's a very good bet that you can trace your heritage back to somewhere in Hiroshima, if your family came over during the plantation period. And in many cases, you're going to find a bunch of other folks around you who are Japanese actually trace their descent back to the same group of people from the same cluster of villages. So this is the Japanese migration to Hawaii, is from one particular spot. And again, it's based on this pressure, this basically push pressure from their Japanese families in Japan to get out because the situation's so disastrous in Japan. So despite the rhetoric, and there's a bunch of books that are written about, the Japanese migration to Hawaii and coming to Sandalwood Mountain, and I can't remember what the poetic terms are. That was all written after the fact. But the reality of the time was that people didn't want to come to Hawaii. Again, these are rural peasants. They have very little education, most of them. They have no idea of any part of their world. Under the Tokugawa period, you were not allowed to even leave your village unless you had a pass from the government. So if you lived in one village and you wanted to visit your relatives 10 miles apart, you had to go to whatever samurai was in charge of the village and actually get a pass from him to go to the other village. When you got there, you had to show the pass or else you'd be executed on the spot. So the Japanese were, each village was almost like its autonomous little thing. That was starting to change by the 1880s, but really hadn't. So the Japanese that arrive here are, it's almost like kids raised in a closet. They have almost no comprehension of anything outside of their village. So you can just imagine when they suddenly end up in Hiroshima, where they get on the ships to come to Hawaii, they've never seen a large town. I've never seen Japanese who even looks, talk with a slightly different accent. They've never seen anyone outside their village. A lot of the last names, Japanese last names, they would have never heard those names before. So you can imagine what happens when they suddenly land in Hawaii. All of a sudden they got Hawai'is, they've got Hawaiians, they've got Chinese, and they got the Portuguese, especially the Portuguese, who are basically their managers. All these different people, which they have no idea they ever existed, they are totally alien to these Japanese. And that's what happens when they arrive here. Total culture shock. And what happens is, as with other groups, is you then test to cluster with the folks that are at least sort of like you, because the rest of your world is so totally foreign to you. Japanese don't raise sugar. So these were rice farmers. So they have no idea what the hell sugar is. They have no idea what they're doing. They're used to volcanic soils, yeah, but not in this way. So they had, they didn't have the experience set to be comfortable with what they were even doing as farmers. So they were totally lost. So in this period, which is basically about 7 years, by the time it's done, 40% of the people in the Hawaiian Islands are Japanese. They're almost, the vast majority are male, between the ages of 16 and maybe 30 years of age. They're clueless. They're like a stereotype of fresh off the boat. Now, what's interesting about Japanese society, and this goes way back, and there's been a bunch of discussions in the Japanese literature about where this comes from. But Japan has a very odd sense of who they are, which is really sort of strange. Okay, hang on a second, someone's got something to say. Noah's asking if Japanese were less likely to identify themselves as Japanese over time. No, no, not at all. They saw being Japanese as being the only way that you could be. What they were is they weren't particularly supportive of the Japanese government, because the Japanese government pretty much, in many cases, just racked their families. So they weren't necessarily, in fact, in many cases, weren't particularly pro-Japanese in terms of the political structure. But in terms of being identified as Japanese, oh yeah, no, they were totally into that. In large cases, actually still are. So yeah, so a good question, but yeah, no, they didn't see being Japanese and the Japanese political thing as being related. And in part that's because Japanese, like, I guess I'm going to do it now. In Japanese society, what you had is it was this totally caste system. You have the samurai, which was your upper part of Japanese society, a very large group, actually, almost 10% of the population was samurai. And then 90% of the population was either peasants or slaves. Japanese had slavery in, I believe, 1905 or something. But you can enslave women right into 1945. So, Japanese had slavery right into the end of World War II. This is a note. So in that system, what you had is the minority population, your classic stereotype of the samurai. For example, even if you're samurai, even in the 1880s, you could literally walk down the street. And if you decided that someone who was a peasant, you didn't like the color of the outfit they were wearing, you could take your sword and just cut their head off right there on the spot. It was a total caste system with a samurai in total control of the society and everyone else entirely at their mercy. So getting out of that, social political structure, Japanese are like, well, if I'm in Hawaii, you can't kill me because you're not over here. Although they didn't realize that until I got here. But yeah, so that's one reason why a large percentage of the population over here, on one hand, they want to go back to Japan to be with family because as with the Chinese, their family ties are incredibly strong. On the other hand, there was probably even more of I'm not sure if that's a good idea thing going on. This changes because by the 1890s, the samurai are basically, dissolved by government proclamation. So you don't have people going around, whacking people just because it's Tuesday. But nonetheless, that power of the samurai, sort of persists in odd ways. In fact, it sort of morphs itself in a bunch of interesting ways, even down to today. So what you get is the population here is here because they have to be here. They really want to go back home. The situation in Japan becomes complicated because unlike China, it doesn't end up in anarchy for the next 100 years. What happens in Japan is the Japanese government starts picking fights with its neighbors, and Japan basically ends up in almost constant war from 1884 or 1885 with the Chinese, where they declare war on the Chinese, have a second war with China. In 1904, they have a war with the Russians. By 1908, 1909, they've taken over Korea. They've taken over Okinawa in the 1890s. They've taken over Formosa, Taiwan. So they're basically sort of picking a fight with everyone off and on. And the folks from Hiroshima were never really trusted into the maybe 1920s period. And so if there was any war, you draft the folks from that area first because if someone has to be killed, it should be someone from Hiroshima. That's the Japanese government attitude. So these folks are not really motivated to go back home in the sense that they're going to be cannon fodder. If there's a war, they're going to have bullseyes taped on their backs by their own government. So they're a little bit, that's a little bit sketchy as far as they're concerned. A unique part that makes Japanese different is that Japanese have sociobiology is a huge thing with almost all populations. Americans have it like everyone else. We oftentimes in the United States tie it to race. Your skin color has some relationship to your attitude and values and stuff like that. That's the classic idea of sociobiology, that social behavior is genetically controlled. In the United States, for some reason, they tied it to skin color. So, your attributes became, how tan your skin was and somehow had something to do with how smart you'd be and stuff like that. Total nonsense, but hugely popular, still is popular in the United States with many groups. In other parts of the world, the sociobiology works differently. Now, with the Chinese, it isn't really with features, it's part of what ethnic group you are. So if you're Han Chinese, then you marry, and you should marry in Han Chinese. That means if you're something else like Mongolian or either Cantonese, you look the same in many cases, but you're not the same. So sociobiology varies from place to place, group to group in terms of how they see it. But most groups do have an attitude that social behavior is inherited through genetics. There's no evidence to support it. In fact, the evidence says it's wrong, but nonetheless, it's sort of, a popular myth that almost every culture engages in. Japanese add a piece to that because Japanese have a really strong sense of sociobiology. But in Japan, what they add is they add place to it. And Japanese society this is actually still legally the case in Japan here in 2020, is that Japanese have a very strong sense that to be really Japanese, two things have to happen. One is you have to be genetically entirely Japanese. Okay? So you can't be Hapa. Secondly, is you actually have to be living in Japan. So Japanese have this idea that not only is the person's genetic makeup critical, but it's sort of, if you want to use a goofy analogy, it'd be sort of like if you're in Japan, radiation constantly hits you and keeps you Japanese. If you leave Japan, then you're not getting bombarded by that, whatever it is, and you're going to lose your Japanese-ness. Now, what this means to Japanese is if you're even a Japanese citizen today, and some of the guys I work with are case in point, if you leave Japan for more than 2 years and you go back to Japan and you work in a corporate environment, say with Toyota, you're going to find that you're never going to be promoted again because you've been gone from Japan 2 months. The general sort of constant logic is 18 months. If you leave Japan physically for 18 months and you never go back, you can just go back and visit for a day or two and then you're good. But if you never go back in, say, 2 years, then when you go back to Japan, people are going to think that somehow you've changed. Your brain has changed a little bit. You're not completely Japanese anymore, and you can't make that up. Now, you see this most strikingly in the Ministry of Education. If, for example, you guys were Japanese students and say you were freshmen in high school, and your dad or mom gets transferred here to Hawaii. So you find yourself in Hawaii for, the next 2.5 years, we'll say. And for whatever reason, your parents don't let you go back home to Japan. But you're actually, we've got a couple of Japanese schools here in the sense that they're actually Japanese accredited Japanese language schools. So you can be taking the same courses you would in Japan. So you go back in your senior, we'll say Kyler goes back to the senior year in Japan. So sitting down in class in your senior year, the teacher's going to go to Thailand, basically say, I'm sorry, you can't stay in this classroom. You're considered a behavioral risk according to the Ministry of Education rules, and you're going to go into a special classroom for disturbed children. And that's the way it works. In the education system in Japan as of 2020 still, if students in the education system leave Japan for more than 2 years and go back in the education system, they're considered to be behaviorally disturbed. And they go in special classes. The chance of getting into universities is just about zero, unless you want to apply as a foreign student, which you might be able to do. So Japan is unique in having this idea that the location of place, in other words, being in Japan, is almost as important as being actually blood Japanese. Now, having said that, if you don't have the blood Japanese part, it doesn't make a difference whether you're in Japan or not. So if someone's Hapa and you move to Japan, or even if you're Hapa and you're born in Japan, like 3rd or 4th generation Korean Japanese, Chinese Japanese, or that semi-famous tennis star right now, if you're anything that's not fully blood Japanese, you're never going to be accepted as Japanese. But if you're actually physically entirely Japanese genetically, but you're not in Japan, then you're not Japanese. So I don't know if we have anyone in class, but if anyone in class is actually entirely, your entire heritage is Japanese, but your family's lived in Hawaii, even if you speak perfect Japanese at home and everything, if you were to move to Japan, we've had a bunch of folks that have done this, and they get very shocked when, as far as they're concerned, they're totally Japanese. They move to Japan and the Japanese don't accept them because they were not born and raised in Japan and they haven't lived in Japan. So it has 2 criteria, not the same 1 criteria that everyone else does. Now, if you think about this, the weird thing about this is it's like the flip opposite of the Chinese. The Chinese attitude is, one, you don't have to be completely Chinese. As long as a part of you is Chinese, you are Chinese. And the Chinese don't give a rat's ass whether you've ever lived in China. You could be 3rd generation Chinese born and raised in Vancouver, British Columbia. And as far as Chinese are concerned, you're still Chinese. The Japanese take exactly the opposite. You can be born and raised totally Japanese ethnically, sociobiologically, et cetera, genetic heritage, the 9th thing. You live in Seattle for 2 years, you ain't Japanese no more. So it's a very different view. And you can imagine you've got these migrants. The migrants all had this. So they come over here and they're on the plantations. And you have to imagine by the 2nd year they're on the plantation, they're looking around and that whole group of folks that came over saying, 1881 or 1886, they're all looking at each other, they're all sitting in their barracks in the plantation. And they realize that if they ever go home, they're not going to be Japanese anymore. Their family will accept them as family members, but everyone's going to be sort of like, yeah, they've got this behavioral issue. I don't know exactly what it is, but they're a little bit sketchy. You got to be careful around them because they're not really all there anymore. And so that becomes a huge motivator to not go back to Japan because you're never going to be Japanese. And even if you marry someone Japanese over here and raise your kids as Japanese, they called kibe, and they're sent back to Japan, those kids have a horrible life because they're never accepted by being Japanese, even in their own families in Japan. So if they get sent back to live with their aunties and uncles in, say, Tokyo or something like that, they're never accepted as being completely Japanese. And so they can never marry someone who's actually a good Japanese. And this is still just as true in 2020. It really hasn't changed at all. It's a very strongly held Japanese value, and it's even, like I said, it's even in the legal system. It's part of the government logic. So geosociobiology is unique. has a huge impact on migrants then. But also if you're dealing with Japanese, because we have a large number of Japanese, we'll get into these later, but have come over, especially since the 1960s and live in Japan. I have a number of friends and stuff that are from Japan. They're Japanese nationals that now live in Hawaii and have lived here for a number of years. You find most cases they'll always go back to Japan for various reasons, at least once a year. But I have a couple of them that just in the last 5 or 10 years have started saying, I'm not going to go back. And it's sort of interesting because what they're doing very consciously in their mind is they're sort of burning bridges with Japan. Because if they stay here for 2 years, they can't go back to Japan. Sure, they can go back. They still have a Japanese passport and all that, but in terms of their social relationships, they're never going to be the same. It's going to be like someone who had a mental crisis and they get over it. But the way that their friends see it, everyone knew about it, was pretty spectacular. And so everyone's going to be looking at them, man, don't piss them off. They might be on the edge. There's always going to be that in the back of the mind. And that's a hugely powerful thing in Japanese society, still is. So Japanese society is very insular, even in 2020. And this has an important aspect of Japanese views of Hawaii and all sorts of other stuff. There's a little bit of that since some of you have started watching those. If you look at that Japanese video, the Japanese tourist in here, done for Sokoka Shidatai back in the 1990s. And to a certain extent, it also plays out in the fact that right now Japan is thinking of allowing Japanese to visit Hawaii, even though they've said that the U.S. mainland will not be allowed. Folks in the U.S. will not be allowed into Japan until April 1st. But there are apparently negotiations with the Hawaii government to allow folks from Hawaii and Japanese to go to Hawaii by apparently November 15th or December 1st. That's because the Japanese view of this place is that there are a large number of people who are genetically Japanese, who are culturally Japanese, and there are large numbers of Japanese citizens, and they're very worried that those folks that really want to get back to Japan desperately, because they have to, because of this sociobiology, will find themselves trapped if they can't get back to Japan before that 2-year clock runs out, as it were. So there's some, you're actually seeing this even in decisions being made this week as we speak. Very, very Japanese, very different, and something to always keep in mind when you're working with Japanese. You never, in my personal opinion, you never ask someone who's actually Japanese national that's here how long they've been in Hawaii, unless you actually freeze it that way. You never want to ask them when was the last time you visited Japan. Don't do it. That's a really bad thing to do unless you know them really, really well. Even though I would not recommend it. It's just a big part of being Japanese. Does that sort of make sense? It's really different. I'm sure if you guys are familiar with it. But you're, at some point, if you're okay, if you're here, you're going to have to deal with it. It's a big part of Japanese mentality. Now, the weird part about that is one of the side effects of that is if we'll say that Sarah is, she's born Japanese, her family's totally Japanese, and she was raised Japanese here, so she can disappear in Japan. And so, she could go to Tokyo and she speaks colloquial, local Tokyo Japanese, and no one even in Tokyo knows she's not from Japan. They are going to be incredibly upset when they find out that she's actually from here. And everyone's going to pretty much ostracize her. On the other hand, if I go to Japan, given the fact that I know about 20 words of Japanese, and I'm obviously not Japanese, but Japanese are going to be much more comfortable with me because they know that I'm not Japanese, and they see her as almost being like counterfeit. And friends I have that have moved to Japan from here, who were raised in what we call samurai families here, they were basically entirely Japanese, found that when they went to Japan, what Sarah would have to do is start speaking bad Japanese. She might know how to speak perfect Japanese, but she's going to intentionally screw it up a little bit. So when she's talking to people from Tokyo, they realize very quickly that she's not actually from Japan. So she actually codes this into her conversation. I've actually been in meetings with folks like this, and people in the Japanese there will actually say, "Oh, wow, your Japanese is really good for a foreigner." And then it's fine, because then they're happy with her because she's made it very clear that I'm not trying to pretend to be truly Japanese, because I don't have that geographical component. Japanese are different, what can I say? Let's see, last part, just to sort of finish up. Japanese have a very different idea of family. And again, this is uniquely Japanese. You don't see us with Korean, Chinese, the other 8 groups from other parts of Asia here in Hawaii. And the reason that it's different is, I think, goes back to the fact that most Japanese originally are from rural settings. You have to remember, Chinese have had cities for 8,000 years. So Chinese tend to be urbanites in many cases, and that's the Chinese model. Japanese have never had this idea of a city as a model, or city as a good thing. They've had the idea of the village or the neighborhood as the good thing. So in Japan, the actual family group that's for legal purposes actually is defined as, on one hand, you have the nuclear family, parents and the kids. The other group that you actually have is called the ie. And the interesting thing is that actually translates as the people that live under the same roof. So if you would, the people that live in the same building. So traditionally, of course, that would have been a large farmhouse. But what that meant is it's not necessarily people that share the same genetic heritage in the sense that they share the same family tree. It can include other people who've been brought into the family or just happen to live in the same house that used to be somewhere nearby. By virtue of being in the same house, they become family. So it's almost like something that it's not the same thing, but it's sort of like the Hanai system was in traditional Hawaii, where family membership was based on acceptance, an agreement that you'll be part of the thing. It's not based on your heritage. This makes it very different than Koreans and Chinese, who are totally hung up on family trees, if you would, lineage. Japanese are very hung up on where you're from. And so what you find in Japanese society traditionally, even still today, and it's very true with Japanese Americans here, is your neighborhood becomes a critical part of who you are. So if you talk to the older Japanese here who grew up in, say, Muide and Makoli area, they'll generally have a sort of a term for the 3 or 4 block area that they grew up in, and they can tell you all the folks that they grew up with and everyone about that, and they're very tight and they're very close, and they actually do a lot of stuff together, and they probably till recently all went to Vegas together, and they all went grad from McKinley together, or they all went grad from Roosevelt together. And that's how they do things. The idea of the neighborhood, which is generally, maybe a 3 to 5 block radius, is actually the main source of identity for many Japanese. And this is still very true in Japan today. If you go to any Japanese city, it's not actually a city, it's a cluster of small neighborhoods. So, Shinsaibashi, for example, in Osaka, which is our favorite area, that's actually surrounded by 4 other neighborhoods like Namba and stuff like that. And people actually say, if you ask them where they're from, they'll say, oh, I'm from Shinsaibashi, or if I'm from Namba or something like that. They won't tell you they're from Osaka, which is a huge city. Now you see the same thing here. If you ask people where they're from, they'll say, oh, I'm from Macaulay, or from Kaimuki, or from Palolo. They don't say I'm from Honolulu. We've picked up that perception, that attitude, as we picked up from the large component of Japanese here as the population, who identified by neighborhood as residents, but also neighborhood as your socially important group. So that's something that Japanese contributed that becomes part of this idea of local. Is our sense of local identity is tied to what would be called neighborhoods, which is very different than the way it is in the US mainland, where generally people will tell what town they're from. Where are you from? Also, I'm from Sacramento, or I'm from San Francisco, I'm from Palo Alto, or whatever it is. They don't, in fact, in many areas, they don't have the term, they don't have neighborhoods per se, they don't have actual terms that are in common use for a neighborhood. Here, if you think about it, everything is neighborhooded, and that's a result of the Japanese influence in the 19th century. That's how Japanese did identify, and that's how Japanese still identify. Sure, you have the last name, you have family, but this idea of the neighborhood group is a hugely powerful sort of second tier to that, or second layer to that thing, which is very different than the Koreans and Chinese, who don't have that. Chinese have the idea of village, but they would never think that the village is as important as your family, that they think you're nuts. Okay. So, does that all sort of make sense?
Yep.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just as a note, something to think about if you're not sure what you're doing when you want to get out, when you get out of Shamanan, since I'm sure this whole nonsense of COVID will be sort of settled down by then. There is the JET program, which we've had a number of students go through, where you basically teach colloquial English in Japan for a year. You have to be a college graduate, doesn't matter what major. The Japanese government pays for it. They provide room and board. They set up the whole system for you. Just go over there and do it. If you live here, you're used to eating Japanese food, so you can do pretty well. You can make a decent amount of money. It's a fantastic experience, and you get basically all expenses paid for a year. The Korean government has something similar, but I'm not that familiar with it. I know we've had at least, I think, 8 or 9 students do the JET program over the years. If you're not sure if you want to go into grad school right away and you want to get some experience in part of Asia, fantastic program. And I'm sure it will start up, once COVID settles down, we'll start up by next fall, I'm pretty sure. So something to think about if you're going to grad in a year or two. So just as a note, since we're talking about Japanese. So, okay, if we're all set on that,